The European Union, or EU, isn't just a political and economic union of 27 member states. It's also one of the most powerful trade blocs in the world. With over 450 million consumers and a combined GDP that rivals the United States and China, the EU wields significant influence in the global economy. But what makes the EU particularly interesting is how it negotiates trade deals on behalf of its member states. In today's video, we're going to dive into how the EU operates as a global trade bloc, the processes behind its trade negotiations, and how these agreements shape both the European and global markets. To understand how the EU negotiates trade deals, we first need to look at what makes the EU a unified economic power. The EU operates as a single market, meaning goods, services, capital, and people can move freely across borders within the bloc. And this creates a huge internal market, allowing member states to trade with each other without tariffs or regulatory barriers. But the power of the EU as a global player comes from its ability to negotiate trade deals collectively. Member states have pooled their sovereignty when it comes to trade policy, which means that instead of each country negotiating its own deals, the European Commission negotiates on behalf of all 27 member states. This gives the EU more bargaining power, as it can negotiate from the position of a much larger economic entity than any single member state could on its own. So, how does the EU actually negotiate these trade deals? The process begins with the European Commission, which is kind of the executive arm of the EU. Specifically, the Directorate General for Trade, which is the department responsible for implementing the EU's trade policy, plays the central role in negotiations. Before the Commission can begin negotiating, it must first receive a mandate from the Council of the European Union. The Council consists of representatives from each member state, usually at the ministerial level, and it's responsible for setting the general direction of EU policies. The Council provides the Commission with a set of guidelines or a negotiating mandate outlining the key objectives and what should be included in the agreement. And this mandate reflects the interests of the member states and is crucial because the EU represents a diverse range of economies with different priorities. Once the mandate is granted, the European Commission takes over the actual negotiations. The Commission's team of negotiators works with a trading partner, whether it's a country or a group of countries, to reach an agreement. And these negotiations can take years and involve multiple rounds of talks, covering everything from tariffs on goods to intellectual property rights, services, environmental standards, and labor regulations. One of the biggest challenges the EU faces in trade negotiations is balancing the different interests of its member states. The EU is made up of a wide variety of economies, from major players like Germany and France to smaller states like Malta or Estonia. And each country has its own economic priorities. For example, France might be more concerned about protecting its agricultural sector, while Germany might focus on securing better terms for its industrial goods. Southern European countries might prioritize access to new markets for their agricultural exports, while Eastern European countries may be more focused on attracting foreign investment. And this diversity makes trade negotiations a complex balancing act. The European Commission must ensure that any trade deal reflects the interests of all member states, which can be tricky when those interests conflict. At times, certain industries or countries might feel that they are being sacrificed for the greater good, and this is where political negotiations within the EU itself come into play. Once a trade agreement is negotiated, it's not a done deal just yet. the agreement must be approved by both the Council of the European Union and the European Parliament. The European Parliament's role has grown significantly in recent years. Under the Lisbon Treaty, which came into force in 2009, the Parliament gained the power to approve or reject trade deals. And this gives the Parliament an important say in the process, and it often scrutinizes agreements from a political perspective, including how they affect environmental standards, human rights, and consumer protections. If the Parliament votes down a deal, it doesn't go ahead, even if the Commission and Council have already approved it. And this makes the EU's trade process more democratic, but also more complex. The European Parliament has blocked or delayed trade deals in the past over concerns about labor standards or environmental protections. For example, negotiations with the United States on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP, stalled due to public and parliamentary opposition over issues like food safety regulations and investor protections. But let's take a look at some of the major trade deals the EU has negotiated in recent years. One of the EU's biggest successes has been its trade agreement with Canada, known as CETA, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. Signed in 2016, CETA eliminated nearly all tariffs between the EU and Canada and has opened up Canadian markets to European companies and, of course, vice versa. The deal was hailed as a landmark agreement, demonstrating the EU's ability to negotiate ambitious trade deals that benefit both sides. Another significant agreement is the EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, which came into effect in 2019. This deal created the largest open trade zone in the world, covering nearly a third of global GDP. It eliminated tariffs on most goods traded between the EU and Japan, including cars, machinery, and agricultural products, and made it easier for European and Japanese companies to access each other's markets. And more recently, the EU has been negotiating agreements with countries like Australia, New Zealand, and Mercosur, that's a South American trade bloc that includes Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. However, these negotiations have been more challenging, particularly due to concerns about environmental and labor standards, especially in relation to deforestation in the Amazon. In recent years, the EU has increasingly focused on ensuring that its trade agreements are aligned with its broader sustainability goals. The EU has been at the forefront of pushing for trade deals that include provisions on environmental protection, labor rights, and sustainable development. And this is part of the EU's broader Green Deal, which aims to make the bloc climate neutral by 2050. For example, the EU-Mercosur deal has faced significant opposition due to concerns about deforestation in the Amazon, as I said, and the environmental impact of agricultural practices in South America. The European Parliament and various EU member states have pushed for stronger environmental protections in the deal, which has slowed down its progress, of course. The EU's emphasis on sustainability in trade deals has also affected negotiations with other partners, as the EU pushes for commitments to reduce carbon emissions and protect biodiversity. This is part of the EU's broader effort to use its economic influence to promote global sustainability standards. The EU isn't just a negotiator of trade deals, it's also a player in resolving trade disputes. As a member of the World Trade Organization, or WTO, the EU is often involved in resolving trade conflicts, whether it's defending its own interests or challenging the practices of others. For example, the EU has been in long-running disputes with the United States over subsidies for aircraft manufacturers Airbus and Boeing. These disputes led to tariffs being imposed on billions of euros worth of goods on both sides, affecting industries from wine to cheese to aerospace. Another recent challenge has been the trade tensions with China. While the EU is one of China's biggest trading partners, relations have become strained over issues like technology transfer, market access, and human rights concerns. The EU has been increasingly vocal about wanting a level playing field with China, pushing for fairer competition and more transparency in trade practices. Looking ahead, the EU's trade strategy is likely to evolve as it grapples with new challenges in the global economy. One key issue will be how the EU navigates its trade relationships in a world where economic nationalism is on the rise and major players like the US and China are engaging in trade wars and protectionism. At the same time, the EU will likely continue pushing its sustainability agenda in trade deals, using its economic influence to set global standards on climate change and workers' rights. And this could make future trade negotiations even more complex, but also position the EU as a leader in creating trade agreements that reflect modern challenges like climate change and inequality. And finally, Brexit has introduced new dynamics into EU trade policy. While the EU has successfully negotiated a trade deal with the UK at last minute, there will be ongoing adjustments as both sides navigate this new relationship on the implementation side. The EU will also need to focus on deepening ties with other global partners to offset any potential loss of trade with the UK. As one of the largest and most influential trade blocs in the world, the EU's approach to trade negotiations has a huge impact not just on Europe, but on the global economy. By negotiating as a unified bloc, the EU wields immense bargaining power and can set the terms for global trade agreements that affect everything from tariffs to labor standards to environmental protection. And while the process of negotiating these deals is complex and can take years, the EU's ability to secure major trade agreements with countries like Canada, Japan, and others demonstrates its effectiveness on the global stage. However, as the world changes, the EU will need to continue adapting its trade strategy, balancing the needs of its diverse member states with the growing demands for sustainability and fair trade practices. The future of EU trade will be one to watch as it continues to shape the global economy and influence international standards. And if you want to know more about this, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll be back.